If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hi, this is Alan. Welcome to the first episode of our Solarpunk column. Instead of our usual one columnist per column, in true Solarpunk style, it will be written by a team of creatives from the Solarpunk community, discussing a wide range of topics from books to podcasts, to environmental issues, to how to build a society around Solarpunk values, and more. If you're interested in Solarpunk and want to learn more, you can look back to a number of our interviews in which we talk with important people in the community, including Andrew Dana Hudson, Sim Kern, Rem Wigmore, Francesco Verso, and the editors of Solarpunk magazine, Justine Norton-Kurtzen and Bree Castagnazzi. In this episode, Navarre Bartz discusses bikes, public transit, densifying cities, along with some great podcast and reading recommendations. And if you like what we're doing, be sure to share our podcast with your friends on whatever social media it is that you use. Thanks.
One of my favorite things about Solarpunk is how it embraces the idea of appropriate technology. Not tech for its own sake, like techno-solutionism, that's going to magically make everything better, or primitivism, which is going to leave a lot of people behind if we say, no thanks on the tech. One area that I think maybe doesn't get talked about as much as it could, that is a sort of appropriate technology, is urban design, where you can actually make a lot of gains in sustainability and livability, especially here in the so-called United States. We don't need smart cities, we need smart solutions. My college roommate was into cycling and got me into it for touring and then doing trips around town. And then it went from, this is a fun thing to do, to, why is it so hard to do this as a form of transportation? Then, also during undergrad, I was on my first public transit ride when I was spending the summer in Boston, which, as someone from a very small town in the Midwest with no public transportation, it was somewhat revelatory. And I thought, wow, you don't need a car or even a bike to get around this town. You can just walk or take a subway or a bus. This is really cool. So what are some ways we can use urban design to make getting around town easier and better for everyone? First of all, having a complete sidewalk network. Ideally also a complete bicycle network. I don't know if you've had it happen to you. If you live in the US, probably you have, where you're walking down the sidewalk, and suddenly the sidewalk just ends. If you're lucky, there's at least a curb ramp. But if you're in a wheelchair or on crutches, you might have a tricky time dismounting a straight curb and then having to either go through grass or a ditch or go along the side of the road until either the sidewalk picks back up or maybe it doesn't. And dedicated bicycling infrastructure, especially separated from traffic on any roads that are higher speed, is something that makes it a lot more comfortable for people to get out on bike if they're able to. Vancouver recently rolled out a fairly extensive network of protected bike lanes, which means that there are ways cars can't get to you when you're in the bike lane. And they saw a large number of families and people with business bikes, think food truck but on a bike, go out and take advantage of this in a sort of if you build it they will come kind of situation. A lot of people aren't really comfortable fighting traffic on a bike. I am becoming less and less so as I get older, and especially now that I have a child riding the bike with me, I would much rather not have to deal with cars while I'm riding down the road. So a protected bike network lets you ride a bike, get places faster than if you were walking, and doesn't require the same sort of infrastructure commitments that public transit does. And as Morten Kabel, the former bike mayor of Copenhagen, has said, how can you afford not to build a bicycle network or a good sidewalk network? Because cycling and walking infrastructure is much, much cheaper than building a similar or even order of magnitude smaller road for cars. Looking a little further beyond the obvious sidewalks and bikes need a place to go, besides in the middle of the street with the cars, when we look at the negative aspects of a person either walking or riding a bike or in a wheelchair getting hit by a car, the main really, really big factor here is the speed. As you drop speeds down, you have a lot better survivability for someone getting hit by a car. There have been studies that show that 20-25 mile per hour speed limits, you don't see a significant difference in travel times for cars in a city, because a lot of that's eaten up by stoplights and things of this nature. But when you drop those speeds that low, your survivability for actual humans in the event of a crash is much, much better. So there are movements like 20 is plenty and others who are pushing to drop those speed limits and make sure that you're actually designing your roads so that people don't exceed that 20 miles per hour. If you leave a 4-lane highway and just post a sign that says 20 miles per hour, people aren't going to slow down for that. You make your roads wigglier, you put in speed bumps, you do things of this nature to lower that design speed of the road, not just the posted speed limit. I could talk all day about some of the different cool projects going on around the world. I could probably talk all day just about superblocks in Barcelona, but if you really want to do a deep dive on some of the different ways we can make transportation better, you can check out the War on Cars podcast or the High Frequency podcast, which is about public transit. Both of those podcasts really look at how public transit and cycling and walking are valid forms of transport and how we can decenter the car when we're looking at how we design our cities. I think Douglas Adams did a really good job of pointing out how car-centric we are in Hitchhiker's Guide. When the alien character Ford Prefect first got to Earth, if you haven't read the books, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, he attempts to make contact with a car because he thinks they are the dominant species on the planet. Another way to make life more pleasant in cities is increasing their density, and not just housing density, but also what around here we call ecological density, which means including plants and animals whenever you're thinking about how you're densifying your cities. First of all, again, we'll start with some low-hanging fruit. Lawns are just bad, okay? There are probably a couple situations where they're good, but outside of that, let's put in more permaculture-type food forests, some more conventional urban gardens, xeriscaping if you're out in the desert, whatever is appropriate to your biome. And as we're building out these pedestrian and cycling networks, we can do them through the use of greenways, and when we're doing that, we're building out these networks that are connected so you can get around without a car. That's lowering our emissions, but then we're also putting in more trees, other greenery. This greenery has a lot of benefits for human mental health and physical health. If you're interested more in that, I'd suggest you check out The Nature Fix, which is a really good book on the subject. Also, with all this vegetation along these car-free routes, there's a good way for wildlife to get around the city. With an acknowledgement of the influence of Afrofuturism on Solarpunk, I think a really good essay about how we design our cities better is Wakanda Has No Suburbs by Kendra Pierre-Lewis, who is someone who also gets around by bike. To quote her, "The message seems to be that Wakanda is a country whose greatest technological achievement is maintaining its environment." In that opening scene of Black Panther, you see this lush landscape, and then, bam, all of a sudden there's a city there. There's no cul-de-sacs surrounding it or anything like this. You got a tram, you got a bustling city going on, and you got big skyscrapers, but there's not a ton of car traffic. That main city in Wakanda is very dense, and it allows the rest of the landscape to exist in a somewhat more pastoral type state. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be people out in rural areas, just that since most people are migrating to cities, we should make those cities as dense as we can and consolidate our impact on the environment to smaller places, and also find a way to make room for the wildlife in those cities. And if we, again, turn to fiction, be sure to check out the Multi-Species Cities anthology from Worldweaver Press, which does talk about this quite a bit. And if you want to look at the rural versus urban divide in Solarpunk, Solarpunk Presence did a podcast episode about that recently. With around 70% of people living in cities by 2050, I think most Solarpunk stories are going to have at least a small urban element since most people are going to be living there. If you are doing storytelling or activism, either one, I suggest you do a little bit of research into urban planning, as much as you feel comfortable, but a little bit probably won't hurt. Not Just Bikes is a great urbanism channel on YouTube. There are a bunch of others as well. You could also check out your local planning commission or volunteer either for a local advisory committee or for a local activism group that works on housing or cycling or walking or parks. And then find the most vibrant spot in your community, whether it's the town square, Times Square if you're in New York, or a nature reserve, and just watch life for a bit. Every place is different. We're not on Hoth or Tatooine where everything's a single biome. Rome wasn't built in a day, and the Solarpunk future isn't going to be either. But as we slowly move our way toward that Solarpunk future, I hope we're keeping in mind how we can use different appropriate technologies to help build a city where we have friendly neighbors, we have those spontaneous interactions that are good for our mental health, and that we find ways to make our cities healthy and bountiful.